Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. So it's been a super long time since I filmed. I think it's been over a month actually. I've just been really busy with work and travel and family for the holidays and such. So yeah, it's kind of surreal to be back into filming. But before the year ended, I wanted to film a best of 2023 makeup video for you guys. Since this is one of my favorite types of content, I think it's really fun to look through the entire year and see what were the products that really stood out. So this video is going to be a true best of 2023 in the sense that this is not just new releases or new products I picked up in 2023. These are instead the products that I most enjoyed, most used, really just found myself gravitating to throughout the whole year. So if you're interested to hear what products were my favorites, just stick around. So let's start, of course, with complexion. And first, the product that actually surprised me the most and that I'll showcase in today's look is this cushion foundation from Jung Mool. This is the shade Medium. And if you guys watched my original video, which was my K-Beauty haul where I first featured this, I actually didn't really like this back then. So I filmed that video when I got back from Korea, I think actually last year. So that was in the summertime. And this product was extremely light on my face at the time. Even though this was the deepest shade they had in store, it was just extremely blindingly white. But as you can see right now that we are in the dead of winter, the shade actually is a very good shade match for me at the moment. And so I've actually found myself using this a ton. And especially, as I'll talk about a lot in this video, this year for me was a much bigger travel year than previous years because finally we've seen a lot of pandemic restrictions lift. I mean, basically all of the pandemic restrictions. And so I found myself traveling a lot. And as a result, a lot of the makeup products you'll see in today's video are ones that are particularly well suited for traveling. And this cushion is a really great example of that. As you can see, it's just super easy to apply. I love that you don't really need kind of a separate brush or sponge. You can just use the provided puff. And I find the finish that this leaves is really beautiful on the skin. You can see this gives you that very healthy, dewy, kind of Korean glass skin finish to the look. And it's just still very natural in that you can still see, some of my blemishes peeking through, but it provides enough coverage to really even everything out. If you compare the two sides of my face, this side definitely you can see more blotchiness, whereas this side is very nice and smooth. So the first time I tried this product for you guys on camera, I didn't really like how, because it was so glowy, I felt like I definitely needed to set it right away. But other than the fact that it needs to be set, I've really just loved how the glowiness of this complexion product looks so healthy, even with powder. And I feel like the cushion format also just allows you to have a lot of control. You can either do kind of a really light layer or kind of build it up a bit more if you want to get more coverage. And I also do like that this product contains a decent amount of SPF. I still do put on sunscreen underneath this, but it is a nice boost to have that additional coverage. And you can just see again just how incredibly glowy this leaves your skin. So of course, if you do have a much deeper skin tone than me, I'm not really sure if this is going to work out for you. There are more shades available online than in store. So this was the deepest shade in store, but online I have seen a few deeper shades. This is a Korean brand that doesn't really seem to have much of a market outside of Korea, so that is, I think, part of why they have such a limited shade range. But I do really hope that they expand at some point because I think the formulation here is really incredible. Now, the next favorite I have is the Kogan-do Aqua Foundation. This is also not new. This was, I think, in my last year's roundup as well. I have this in shade 123. And I love this so much that in my recent Japan trip, I actually bought the Moisture Foundation as well in the same shade. In fact, I bought like pretty much every single product from Kogundo when I was in Japan, because between the exchange rate and tax-free status, it was just really, really great. So definitely stay tuned if you guys are interested in my Japan haul. That's the next video I plan on filming, and I got a lot of products in that haul. But anyway, in terms of this foundation, this has quickly risen to be one of my all-time favorite foundations. It is such a beautiful, lightweight, but buildable product. So if you put a light layer on your face, it kind of won't look like you really have any product at all, but it still is very perfecting, and you can definitely build it up to get pretty high coverage. Even with a lot of layers though, it feels really lightweight. It never looks cakey. And I also love the powders that Kogundo has as well, so those pair really perfectly. For context, I do have normal to dry skin, and so I do like a product that is somewhat hydrating, but I also don't like it to be slipping and sliding around my face. And so I feel like this is a really perfect in between, in that it's not going to be one of those products where you feel like, wow, my face just feels greasy all day, and if I touch my face, it's gonna move around. But at the same time, it also doesn't dry out your face or make it feel tight as the day goes on. So I just love the versatility of this. I think it's perfect for an everyday basis, but also perfect for events. So would highly, highly recommend this foundation. And then the last foundation is the Merit Beauty Stick in the shade Sand. This is a travel inspired pick. So if I were just at home, I usually don't use this that often, but I always bring this with me when I travel because it's not a liquid, it's very compact. You can use this as both a foundation and concealer, though I usually do pack a separate concealer just for some extra coverage. What I love about this product is it's just so easy to use. So you can just blend it in with your fingers. It swipes on super easily. It blends out like a dream. As you can see, it's a little bit deep and warm for my current winter complexion, but I think the shade Sand generally works well for me kind of year round, especially if I'm doing more of a sheer layer. And this finish also is just really great for an everyday basis, especially when you're traveling. And for me, I often am traveling for work, and so I don't really want to look very makeup-y. I just want my complexion to look perfected and natural, so when people are looking at me in person, they don't feel like I have a lot of layers of makeup on. And so that's what this product delivers. It's just super natural, very easy to use, and every single time I travel, I always have to bring this with me. So moving right along, there were a lot of concealer launches this year, but I have to say, the #1 concealer for me of the year was actually the Dior Forever Skin Correct Concealer. I have this in shade 2N, and this is not at all a new concealer. So this has been around for quite a while. It's an oldie but goodie. And even though I did try a decent number of the newer concealers, I felt like there was just nothing that really matched this concealer. So this was still the one that I ultimately found myself gravitating to the most. So what I love about this concealer is, for one, the finish is beautiful. It really doesn't look dry or cakey at all, which, especially in my under eye area, is a really big deal for me. I do have quite a lot of under eye creases. It's sort of part of my makeup routine where I find my face is the most finicky, and so I am quite picky with under eye concealer. And typically what I find is a lot of products, if they don't crease a lot, they are quite drying, and if they are hydrating enough, then they're gonna just really pool in my creases. This concealer is the best that I found in terms of minimizing those two issues. Now, it's not perfect. Any sort of concealer is going to pool a little bit, but of all the ones I've ever tried, at least, this one has definitely performed the best. And I find this shade 2N is pretty good throughout my face. I can cover blemishes, I can do my under eye area. It is a very neutral shade as well compared to most of my concealers. I find that most concealers run a little bit orangey, which is fine to me for color correcting, but sometimes I just want something super neutral, and this definitely has that slight grayish undertone to it that makes it really neutral and not lean too yellowy or orangey or pinky. And I'm just so amazed at how well this product maintains that high level of coverage while still being very elastic on the skin and looking relatively natural. So today I kind of built it up just so you guys could see it, and because I'm doing a full glam look, but you can also just apply a little bit of this with your finger. In fact, when I'm traveling, I often just go with these two products and put this all over the face, just take a little bit of this on my finger and dab it where I need a bit more coverage, and I find that works perfectly. So next for eye primer, we have the ABH eye primer. There's really only one eye primer that I was using all of 2023. I would switch kind of back and forth between this and my Urban Decay, Too Faced, and some other options, but I would always return to this one. Basically, ever since I tried this ABH eye primer, it's been my ride or die. What I love about this primer is that I find most eye primers work pretty well for shimmers. They provide some adhesion so your shimmers stick more and you get less fallout. But the problem they have is the stickiness makes them really adhere to mattes. And so then your matte eyeshadows end up getting all patchy. And for me, I have more problems with my mattes than my shimmers, and so it's a bigger deal to me if my mattes are getting patchy versus if my shimmers are having some fallout. In fact, if I'm using a very shimmery shade, I'll just go in with some mixing liquid or my Pat McGrath mixing liquid pen, and I find that works a lot better than eye primer for having those really stick. And so when it comes to just an everyday basis, when I'm doing a glam look, this is the perfect primer for me. It also, as you can tell, is quite brightening. So if you do have a really deep skin tone, I'm not sure how well this will work for you. But for me, I do like the brightening property when I'm doing a glam look because it makes the shadows just look more true to color, because it kind of neutralizes some of the shade of my actual eyelids and lets especially pastels or colorful shades stand out more. So now for brows. I had two brow pencils that I really loved this year, but kind of for different types of looks. So first we have the Huda Beauty Brow Pencil. This was my favorite last year and kind of remains my favorite for days when I do want a more precise brow look. So you can see just how thin this brow pencil is. It's one of the thinnest that I've ever experienced on the market. And I find that this just means it's really, really easy for me to do hair-like strokes. And so whenever I use this brow pencil, I find that I have a lot of control in terms of either doing something that's very natural and wispy or doing something that's super defined, because I can really easily just trace my brow shape and fill it in with these fine strokes. This shade, Soft Black, also works really well with my hair color. I find a lot of brow pencils are a little bit too warm and almost reddish brown, but this is definitely quite gray brown. On days though when I want to be a little bit less finicky, I love going in with my Gucci brow pencil. This is in shade 4, and this is a much chunkier pencil. I mean, you can sharpen this to be sharper, but like for me, I just prefer using this on days when I just want to kind of quickly draw some strokes in my brows. Don't really want to think about it very much. And this formula is a powder consistency. It's sort of like a cream to powder. And so as a result, once you brush it out, it looks very soft and natural. And I really love that in terms of just ease of use. As you can see, it's not going to give you like as much precision as this side, but that was just so quick and easy. I really didn't have to think about it at all. And so I find for an everyday basis, this one is amazing. And then for brow gel, I vacillated a lot on this, but overall my favorite was definitely the Merit Brow Gel. This is also one that I think I featured in last year's video. What I love about this brow gel is it's very easy to use and you really don't have to think about it. Basically, it's sort of a liquidy formula that has not a super strong tint to it. So you can see I can just sort of brush this through my brows, not really thinking about it, not worrying about whether it gets on my skin, and it just provides a little bit more volume and dimension to my brows and a bit more tint as well. This is not going to be a brow gel that fully sets your brows, laminates them, or makes them look really intense. This is very much just an everyday brow gel. That said, for me, that's what I love about it. Most days I'm not trying to go for sort of like a feather laminated brow look, and it's more important to me that I don't accidentally mess up my whole makeup look by putting on too much brow gel, which for some of my other products can very easily happen. And on days when I am not doing a full glam look, I just brush this through my brows, and that's pretty much all I do for the brow look. So moving right along, this year was a really big year for cream and liquid products. Now, I am mostly a powder aficionado when it comes to makeup, and so I really had to step out of my comfort zone a lot this year in terms of trying these new products. And I would say at the end of this year, I am still overall much more into powder products, but I have found some cream products that have really captured my heart as well. So first off, in terms of cream bronzer, the standout for me this year was the LYS bronzing stick. So I have this in shade Harmony, and if you guys watched my recent bronzer roundup, you know that I also really love the Charlotte Tilbury. That one is a little bit more of a cream powder hybrid, so I find it very approachable. But when it comes to true cream formulas, this product really surprised me quite a lot because it seemed like it would be my worst nightmare, frankly. And I didn't anticipate liking it because, as you can tell, it is very creamy, and it's also in a stick. And typically those are things I really do not enjoy. As a powder fan, I like having the control of kind of dipping in with a brush and not necessarily swiping directly on my face. And also, typically when it comes to super creamy formulations, I feel like I just don't have enough control over them, and I'm always worried they're just going to never really set down and just be really sticky on my face and get everywhere. But I've been so impressed with just how easily this product blends out and how easy it is to control it on the face. Once you blend it out, there's really no remnant of where the original lines were. And even though it's super creamy, it does set pretty well. It's not one of those products where your hair is just gonna be constantly stuck in it all day. And the shade Harmony is maybe a little bit deep for my complexion right now, but I think it actually shears out pretty well, such that even if you do have a lighter complexion, you can still make it work. This is the medium shade, and so I think, you know, for my winter complexion, I probably should go in with a lighter shade. But as you can tell, it still works for my complexion. As a side note, the brush that I'm currently using, the BK Beauty 111 brush, is by far my favorite brush for cream bronzer. I also love the BK Beauty 107 brush, and that was my favorite for a while. But I think this one is just the perfect shape to be able to get into the contours of your face and also provide a very even blend of the product. The brush I use for the concealer, which is the BK Beauty A506, is actually my favorite concealer brush, so would also highly recommend this one. And the BK Beauty 109 brush, which I'm going to use for the next product, is one of the brushes I would most recommend from this entire year. This is a game changer when it comes to cream blush. I actually didn't really think I liked cream blush before I bought this brush, but since getting it, basically every single cream blush has blended out like a dream. So would highly, highly recommend this brush. This one's definitely the one I would recommend the most if you're just buying one synthetic hair brush for cream products. So speaking of cream blush, we next have the Danessa Myricks blush in the shade Rosé and Brunch. So this one is a little bit of a cheat in that even though it's a cream blush, the upslide technology in it makes it a little bit more of a powder finish. But that personally is what I love so much about this blush. You can see it is very pigmented, but it also blends out like a dream. And with upslide technology, it is not a sticky product. Once it really settles into your skin, it has a bit more of a powdery dry down. It still gives you that nice flush and dewiness that you would expect from a cream or liquid product, but it's very long lasting on the skin. It's not one of those blushes that's just gonna fade immediately or get on your hair or clothes. And it's just so easy to use, really, really blends like a dream. And especially with this brush, I find that I never have any trouble whatsoever with this. Again, it is very pigmented, so that's the one thing to be a little bit careful about if you are any lighter than me, especially because I think Rosé and Brunch is actually maybe the lightest shade in this collection, but it is just such a pretty healthy flush that it provides. As a side note, let me know if you guys would be interested in a cream blush roundup at some point, because I have a very long list of cream blush products that I've tried and ranked, but just haven't really gotten around to filming a video. Those are always kind of harder to film because you want to showcase all the products, but it's pretty hard to showcase like 10, 15 blushes. But let me know, maybe I'll do like top 5 or something like that. So for powder, I actually don't have a powder that I would necessarily say really stood out to me this year, but the one I used the most was the Pat McGrath Under Eye Setting Powder. I have this in the shade Medium. And I have to admit, a lot of that's just because this is a very small, compact, pressed powder. So when I've been traveling, that's what I'm looking for. I don't really want to have a loose powder and have to deal with all the mess associated with that. And then even though this is supposed to primarily be an under eye setting powder, I find that if I use a small amount of this, it does work well all over the face. The reason I hesitate to just say outright this is a favorite is that I do have kind of a finicky relationship with this powder. For the longest time, I actually didn't like it because I found that it was a little bit drying on my skin. When I use this powder, I do need to either use a very hydrating base like I have on today, or just be quite careful in my application. I mean, as you can see, it does a beautiful job of really smoothing things over. It's a very blurring powder, so it's very effective. But because my skin is a bit on the drier side, I do just find if I'm not careful with this powder, I can easily overdo it, and then my whole face does start looking a bit dry as the day wears on. So that's my one caveat with this, but especially if you have more normal to oily skin, I would highly, highly recommend this powder. It does a great job at mattifying and blurring and perfecting the complexion. And even though it's quite small, I find that it lasts a long time because it is just so finely milled. You only need a little amount of it to set your face. And you can see today I am just trying to be very careful as I'm applying it. Now, normally at this point, I would go into eyeshadow or into powder complexion products, but because my lips are feeling pretty dry, I think actually I'll go directly into lips and then we will circle back around. So I was a little bit embarrassed when I picked out the set of lip products because I've been in such a rosy lip mood this entire year that basically all of these products have quite similar shades, even though they're different formulas. So starting with lip liners, these were my top 3 for the year. No new formulas, these are my ride or die formulas. Overall, my most used was probably Charlotte Tilbury's Lip Cheat in Pillow Talk Medium. This for me is just a really perfect everyday color. So you can see it's actually quite similar to my natural lip tone. It has that rosiness, but is still neutral enough to work really with any look, and especially when I'm traveling, what I love about this is I can just put this on my lips and then kind of put any lip color on top, and it'll just look like a mix of my natural lip color and that lip color. So even if I'm not doing a sort of rosy look, it still will work just because it looks so similar to my actual lip color. I also have these two lip crayons from Natasha Denona. We have P7 Renee, that's my newest one, which is kind of a deep rose, and then we have P5 Gaia. And Gaia is definitely the one that I ended up using the most this year. You can see it's kind of similar to Pillow Talk Medium, just a bit stronger on the rose side. And I've been really enjoying pinky rosy lips for some reason. I find they're just really flattering, and I've been doing a lot of cooler toned eye looks this year, and I find this sort of lip tends to go pretty well with that kind of look. And the Natasha Denona formula is still my all-time favorite formula in that it's the creamiest, most long-lasting formulation for lip liner that I've ever tried. You can maybe even just see that in the swatches. It glides on with tons of pigmentation. It's super creamy. And usually you don't see those two things simultaneously, like really creamy lip liners just won't last. Drier ones will last longer. But these really buck the trend. They're extremely creamy, but also very, very long lasting. It's quite hard actually to wash these off once you apply them. You do need to use an oil cleanser at the end of the day. The Charlotte Tilbury is drier and less long lasting than the Natasha Denona. So for the lip cheat, it's really about the shade for me. So since I'm not really sure which direction this look is going into yet, I'm gonna just go in with Pillow Talk Medium for now. I might change this up later, depending on what happens with the eye look. I have a bunch of palettes to share with you guys. But as you can see, this just looks very, very similar to my lip shade, just a bit deeper. And so I find it really easy to use and just fill in my lip color. And for the lipstick, I'm going to go into my Chantecaille Lip Chic in the shade Calla Lily. This is one of my most used shades. It's the one that's been sitting in my purse throughout this year. You can see this is sort of a sheer, rosy, currant shade. What I love about this is that it's so hydrating on the lips. You can see it has a nice sheen to it on application. It's really easy to apply. The fact that it's sheer means that you really don't have to be very precious with it. You can apply this without looking in a mirror. You can just sort of dab some on. And it's so comfortable on the lips. My lips were feeling pretty dry, but now they feel just really cushioned and nourished by this. I find this shade is very flattering on my skin tone and kind of works with a very wide variety of looks. And so that's why this guy has been living in my handbag. Other lipsticks I've been loving this year include Iris from Wayne Goss. So this is kind of a very similar shade to Calla Lily. I also love bringing this in my purse, and especially when I'm at work, this is the shade that I go to the most often. I think it's a nice rose that still has enough neutralness in it to look quite natural. You can tell these two formulas are quite different. This one is high pigment. It is less shiny, less hydrating, but in my experience, much more long lasting. And so if I know I'm gonna go through a whole day where I can't really reapply lipstick, but I still want it to be comfortable, then this is my go-to. I find that you can sort of apply this, take a tissue to sort of blot it, apply another layer, and then it really lasts throughout the day. It's not like waterproof or anything like that. I mean, if you eat, you do need to reapply, but it's surprisingly long-lasting for how comfortable it is, and the pigmentation level is just really great as well. On the more glowy side of things, though, we have Glowing Gen from Charlotte Tilbury. This is in her Kissing formula, which is still one of my all-time favorite formulas. This is sort of in between the last two, both in terms of shade and in terms of formulation. It's more hydrating than the Wayne Goss, but definitely slips and slides a lot more. So if you're worried about lipstick getting on your teeth, this formula is not the best for that. You do definitely need to check your teeth when you have this on, but it is so comfortable and also so high in pigmentation. So other than it often getting on my teeth, there's really nothing I dislike about this formula. It's still one of my all-time ride or die. Now, a few brand new lip formulas this year, to me at least, include the Cosmetics Everglass Lip Dew in the shade Temptress. So this is kind of like an even more hydrating version of the Chantecaille, but with very high pigmentation, as you can see. So I really love this on days when I want something that does provide me that glam finish in terms of pigmentation, but is really, really comfortable on the lips. I feel like I haven't really featured this product much on my channel, but it's actually one of the ones I've used the most on a daily basis. And because it is a gloss, you can sheer it out as well. You don't have to have it be at full pigmentation, but it is just incredibly, incredibly comfortable on the lips. Another product I've been using almost on a daily basis is the Dior Lip Oil in the shade Mahogany. If you guys haven't watched it, I do have a video comparing this with the K.I.S.S.I.N.G lip oil, and in that video this overall came out a little bit on top, but ever since that video this has really become my top by far, and I use this far more than the K.I.S.S.I.N.G lip oil. They're both still great, but I find that this one is just so wonderful for an everyday basis in that it has a very thick, nourishing texture to it. So if you have super dry lips like me, I think you'll really enjoy this. And the hydration is very long lasting because of that thickness. The K.I.S.S.I.N.G one is much lighter, and so it's not going to keep your lips hydrated as long. And then also, even though this is a very, very sheer tint, I find that because it has that slight pH changing technology, it does leave a subtle tint on your lips such that even when the pigmentation has faded, your lips are still a little bit tinted. And for me, that's kind of perfect for an everyday basis. I didn't think I would like the pH thing because it seems a little gimmicky, but I actually really like how it looks, at least with this formula. It's the perfect way to kind of not really look like you have any lip pigmentation on your lips, but to have a bit more of a flush to the lips. Finally, we have the bougiest lipstick in my collection, which is this Bond number 9 lipstick. This was like $110, and I have this in the shade Central Park. So this comes out of the case like this. It's a refillable packaging, and this is the one shade that's a little bit different in this lineup. It's a bit warmer in tone, very high pigmentation. You can see this formula is a little bit drier than the other ones. This is not a super, super nourishing, instantly fill your lips with hydration kind of formula, but it is very, very long lasting and extremely comfortable and nourishing compared to what you would think, considering it is that more satin finish. And so I wouldn't say this is necessarily worth the $110 and that you can definitely get similar impact with less money. But if you are someone who has a substantial makeup collection, or you just want something that is really luxe and different, I do think that this is special. It is a unique formula just in how much it envelops your lips, really lasts on your lips, but doesn't feel drying at all, even though it's so lightweight and leaves a really nice satin finish. The packaging is also just extremely luxe as well. It has that nice magnetization here. And so if you are someone who wants to treat yourself or treat someone else, I would highly recommend checking this out. So with the lips out of the way, let's get into what is typically my favorite category, which is eyeshadow. So if you guys have been watching me for a while, you know that like my channel tends to revolve around eyeshadow because I love doing different sorts of colorful eye looks. Now, this year was kind of unique in that regard, in that for the first time ever, I found myself gravitating a lot more to neutral looks. Part of this was because of the traveling, but also, I don't know. I don't know if I became more boring this year, but at least in terms of colors, I think you saw this a little bit with the lip shades as well. I tended to just kind of gravitate towards certain colors this year instead of experimenting as much. As a result, the products I loved and used the most this year actually ended up being quite neutral. So first off, I would say my overall top eyeshadow palette of 2023 was actually the Dior Soft Cashmere. So this was surprising, both because it is not a new palette in my collection, and also, as you can see, it's a pretty tame, pretty boring, kind of cool neutral color story. But this is what I was going for, like, all the time. And this formulation especially is just really, really beautiful. What I love so much about this palette is it gives you a lot of variety in terms of how glam you want to go. So this shade in the center is just a very nice satin pearl finish where it doesn't look shimmery on the lids, but there is just enough pearl so it also doesn't look matte. And the shade itself, I find, looks really natural on my lids. And actually, maybe, why not? Maybe I'll put this on my lids today. I was going to do something a bit more colorful with the other palettes, but as I'm saying this was truly the palette that captured my heart this year, so I should probably be true to that and put this on my lids. So let me actually bring you guys closer for this component. So yeah, let me first just go in with this first shade so you guys can see it. I find this shade works for a lot of different purposes. You can put it all over your lids just for a very, very simple one and done, and I would often do that on days when I'm going to work and don't really want to have to mess around with having a very intricate eye look. But you can also use this as a transition shade like I'm showing you guys right now. That's really the magic of this, being that kind of very finely milled satin finish. It can be used as a matte or as a shimmer, just depending on how you want to do your look. In addition, I really love this deep shade here. This is one of the deepest browns I've seen from a luxury makeup brand. Typically, depth is something that I really struggle with when it comes to luxury fashion house makeup brands. I think they tend to go for a very soft look to achieve that sort of, you know, like Chanel elegance, for example. But as you can see, this is very dark. You can really build up this shade. You can use it as a liner, or you can do what I'm doing today, which is just kind of deepening your outer third with it. And so I love the versatility of this because it just allows you to transition things from day to night very easily. Typically, if I were doing this for a day look, I would just run this along my lash line to kind of set my eyeliner and call it a day. But for today's look, we're going a bit more glam, and so I am just kind of putting it all over. Next, for shimmer, you have a few options. So this shade over here is beautiful. I really love this one, and I'm going to use this kind of all over the lids today. You can see it has gorgeous shine, and a lot of luxury palettes also don't really deliver in the shine department because, again, they're going for kind of subtle elegance. But personally, I love how this is not like super in your face per se. It still has kind of a finely milled elegance to it, but between the fact that it does have that silvery flip to it and it is just very foiled, it can still give you a very glam look. In terms of this shade over here, if you want something that is less shiny but has a similar silver effect, this will give it to you. You might not be able to see it as I layer it on top of the other shade, but it gives you that additional versatility, especially if you want something less light than this. You want something that is a little bit more grungy and gray toned, then this is a really lovely shimmer to go into, give you that kind of gunmetal effect. Finally, I can't say I'm a huge fan of this shade over here. It's probably my least favorite in the palette. It's fine. It's pretty. It's kind of glittery. I sometimes use this just to sort of top the other shade and provide a little bit more shine in the middle of the lid. But I find that because this is very glimmery, it doesn't work the best for inner corner brow bone highlight, at least by my preferences. And so I'm not as much of a fan of this shade, but it's still lovely, and the other shades kind of more than make up for it. So as you can see, that was just a super, super easy, smoky kind of cashmere eye. Really, really glam as well. For the lower lash line, I'm going to just kind of repeat these steps by starting with that middle shade, going in with a bit of deepening in the outer corner, and then putting some of the shimmery shade in the inner 2/3 and connecting it with this metallic shade. So there we go. I'm gonna go off camera and do the other eye and then be back to talk about the other palettes. So here we have the completed eyeshadow look. What do you guys think? So zooming you guys out, before we get into the other eyeshadows, I realized I should also talk briefly about eyeliner. So if you have been watching pretty much any of my videos this year, these will not come as a surprise because I really haven't been deviating much from my favorites. Basically, what I have on today is my M Cosmetics liner in brown. This is my holy grail eyeliner. I've never tried one that comes close to this in terms of just the level of pigmentation, the precision it gives me, the control it gives me. And also I love this brown color because as you can see, it looks pretty dark. Like if I didn't say it's brown, you probably would just think that I have black liner on. But whenever I go from this to a black liner, I can see a pretty big difference. Basically, this brown shade is just a little bit less stark than black liner, which is what I'm looking for. I don't like brown liners that are really warm, kind of reddish. I feel like that looks really unnatural against my complexion. This has that really cool, kind of almost black look, but it's just a little bit more subtle than black eyeliner, so it doesn't draw as much attention away from the eyeshadow look. In addition, throughout this year, I have nonstop been using these eyeliners from Sister Anne, which was probably one of my favorite finds of last year. I got these when I was in Seoul, and for context, I have really watery eyes. My eyes get irritated easily, and so even though I always do put liner in my waterline, I find that usually it doesn't last and it often smudges, kind of gets all over my under eye area. And so for me, this was really a major game changer. These are by far the most long-lasting eyeliners I've ever tried. Now, they're not 100% budge-proof, but I've tried pretty much every liner on the Western market, and these blow them out of the park in terms of just how well they grip to my waterline. And I have this in several shades. The dark brown one is the one I always use on the outer portion of my eyes. And then I also have Baby Peach and Champagne Gold. These I really like using as an accent on the inner thirds of my waterline. So these have been the ones I've used in pretty much every video this year. Now for today's video, I actually went in with my Wayne Goss Essential Kohl Liner. I have this in the shade Tiger's Eye. And this has been the only one that I've sort of deviated from Sister Anne to wear occasionally. You can see this is kind of a lighter brown. It actually is not matte. It has shimmer particles. I'm not sure if you guys will be able to see that. Let me actually give you guys swatches of the other liners just so you can see the difference. So here's the matte brown Sister Anne. You can see how creamy and pigmented that is. So the Wayne Goss is not going to be as long lasting as the Sister Anne, but what I love about it is really the tone. This Wayne Goss one, because it has that nice shimmery effect to it, I find just looks really beautiful all over the lower lash line, and especially on days when I want something a little bit more subtle than going in with the shinier Sister Anne ones. The Wayne Goss will give a bit more of that subtlety, but still have just a little bit of interest because it has that slight glimmer. And overall, it still is a very long-lasting liner compared to other ones on the market, just not quite as much as the Sister Anne. In terms of other eyeshadow palettes, the other one that I found myself using the most this year, which was a huge surprise to me, was this little Kaja Bento in the Color Story Chocolate Dahlia. So I was really surprised because this is not really like a luxury brand, and I'm usually quite a snob when it comes to eyeshadow. But this is just the perfect little travel palette. Basically, whenever I've traveled, I've always brought this with me. It has these 3 shades over here and then this tiny mirror, which is kind of useless but cute. It has a chocolate brown, which is a great deepening shade, has this really good taupey brown transition shade, and then it has this champagne shimmer, which is great all over the lids or as brow bone or inner corner highlight. And so I find if I want a really simple professional matte look, I just go in with these 2 mattes. If I want something a little bit more glam, then I'll go in with the shimmer. But this is just super, super easy to use, very high quality, very blendable, and you'd be hard pressed to find a more travel-friendly palette just in terms of how compact this is and how versatile it is. Generally, I've traveled with this and the Dior to give myself a bit more versatility. Typically, I'll just kind of start out with these 2 mattes over here and then go in with the deeper Dior matte as liner and then the middle shade from Dior kind of all over the lids. And that's my standard work look, sort of no makeup. And then whenever I want a bit more shimmer, I'll go into this shimmer shade plus the other shimmers in the Dior to kind of glam it up like I did today. Now, in terms of slightly more colorful eyeshadow palettes, one surprise hit for me this year was the Mini Gold palette from Natasha Denona. Again, not a new palette, but one that I found myself reaching for quite a lot. This is just the perfect gold, green, olive color story. For some reason, I've been really gravitating to this sort of color story lately, and I feel like there haven't been a ton of new releases with this. There is one new release I'll talk about, but most of the other brands haven't really come out with this color story in a while. And what I love about this is it does a good job of being relatively neutral and everyday friendly, because green kind of, I think, inhabits that middle zone of being kind of close enough to brown, especially if it's in this olivey undertone, that you can really wear it on a day where you're not feeling super colorful, but it's still, of course, more colorful than, say, the look that I did today. And so it's just a very flexible color story. Even though this is Mini Gold, I think this is really a perfect green color story because these 2 just give you that lovely green effect. And this one has a slight green flip to it as well. And I also just really love the quality of this palette. This middle shade is very high shine, really, really beautiful. This shade over here has a nice dual chromatic effect to it. And even this shimmery deepening shade is very easy to use as well. And the 2 mattes also blend like a dream. So if you are interested in this color story, I would highly, highly recommend this. And I bought this along with a bunch of minis, filmed the video. In general, if you guys are interested in any of these products, I do have dedicated videos to all of them. But I was just so surprised how this one really ended up moving to the top of the pile in terms of my eyeshadows. My other favorite this year was also from Natasha Denona and also in kind of a similar color story. This is the Yucca palette. This palette drew me in the moment I saw the promos. This is a color story that I've been wanting to see from brands for a while, but have not. And so I really, really loved when she came out with this. So if you guys watched my Natasha Denona ranking video, this one really shot up to be on the top of that list, which again was kind of surprising because I have a lot of Natasha Denona palettes. There's a lot of competition. And honestly, until this year, I didn't really think of myself as a big green eyeshadow person. But what's so great about this palette is, again, it's green, but in a very approachable way. Like, honestly, if you remove the kind of 2 cooler green shades, the rest of the palette actually is quite neutral and approachable for an everyday basis. You can do more of kind of a warm look with this if you want to kind of stick with more of the orangey tones. The shade Fuchsia especially is really, really pretty, along with the shade Ixia. They look really gorgeous and unique on the lids. But you can also do a very green look by focusing in on these sorts of mattes, maybe deepening with this. And the shimmers in this palette are very unique for Natasha Denona in that we have several of her sparkling metallics, 4 of them actually, which is way more than in any of her previous palettes. And this is my favorite formulation shimmer-wise from Natasha Denona because it is just so high shine. Like, let me give you guys a swatch, for example, of Macchia. You can see how high impact that shade is. It sort of reminds me of indie shadows, not quite as shiny as them, but considering how easy to use this is and from a mainstream brand, it is a really, really remarkable formula. And what I love about this formula is it looks very similar to if you put on a Pat McGrath metallic and then topped it with one of her astral shades. And for the longest time, that for me was what was lacking in Natasha Denona palettes. She would have toppers, but they would be kind of lackluster. And her metallics were pretty, but they never had that punch that you get from Pat McGrath. This sparkling metallic formula, though, for me really started changing that game. It's not 100% like Pat McGrath, but it really pushes it to be much, much closer. And also because it's just one shadow, it is much easier to use rather than having to go in with an astral topper. And with 4 of them in this palette, some of which even have a bit of shift to them, you can really amp this palette up a lot. You can do an all matte look, you can do a look with just a metallic, or you can have that really high shine glam look. And so that's why this palette really stood out to me and I found myself reaching for it so much. The only thing I don't like about this palette is this one shade Fuchsia, which is one of my favorite shades in the palette. Kind of got hard pan really quickly. You guys can probably actually see it has that sort of grayish tinge to it now. I don't know what happened to that. I can still use it if I really, really dig my brush into it, but that's the one disappointment from this palette. If I could replace Fuchsia, everything else would be stellar. So those were my top eyeshadow palettes of 2023. I do have some honorable mentions though. So we have a final Natasha Denona palette, the Mini Trio Chrome. This is a really, really cute blue color story. It's an honorable mention because I honestly don't wear blue eyeshadow that much, but I would say if you're someone who has any interest in blue eyeshadow, this is a really great palette to have in your collection because it'll basically take care of any and all blue eyeshadow needs without needing to buy a large colorful palette in order to get that. The quality is impeccable in this palette. Blue is usually very hard to formulate and blue mattes especially usually don't pack much of a punch, but these shadows all work really, really impeccably and you can actually achieve a decent number of different kinds of looks. You can do much more of a frosty sort of frozen look with the lighter shades. You can leverage this Trio Chrome shade to do something a little bit more ocean, siren inspired. So there's a lot of different directions you can take this even with the relatively consistent color story. And so for me, as someone who likes blue eyeshadow but doesn't really have that much blue in my collection, I really enjoy having this to round things out. Now, the big elephant in the room, of course, is Pat McGrath eyeshadows. So I do have 2 honorable mention palettes I wanted to talk about. This is the first year I have not included Pat McGrath eyeshadows automatically in my best eyeshadows of the year. Typically there's no question whatever mothership she's released would just automatically end up in this best of list. But you know, I have to be honest with you guys. I need to tell you guys what I actually have been using, what I've actually been enjoying. And the truth of the matter is, even though Sunlit Seduction is really beautiful, it's a lovely color story. I personally am a huge fan of sunset color stories. It's just not been inspirational to me, and I filmed several looks with this, and I actually have like 3 or more videos dedicated to this palette on my channel, including a lot of comparison swatches, a lot of discussion about the controversy of this palette. But after filming all of those, I would, occasionally dip into this just to kind of like force myself to use it. But it's not a palette that I think to use or really inspires me on an everyday basis. And so I'm sad to say that this only gets an honorable mention for this year. I mean, there's still something exceptionally special about Pat McGrath's packaging for her motherships, and the quality for most of these shades is impeccable. But there were just a few things that for me fell short with this. For one, in terms of quality, this shade over here is pretty hard to use. It's very flaky. It falls off your lids. It's very chunky. Not what I would expect from Pat McGrath. She's also gotten rid of her baked formula, which was my favorite from her. So even though these new Astral shades are very nice and are very beautiful and glittery on the lids, they just don't have the same uniqueness as her previous motherships did. And the rest of these shades are just fine. They're like the most standard shades you can get from Pat McGrath. And so if I'm looking for this kind of color story, there's honestly just a lot of other Pat McGrath palettes in my collection that I would think to reach for over this. Indeed, when I'm thinking of a sunset color story, I usually go more for Divine Rose 2. So if you're new to Pat McGrath, don't really have many or any of her palettes, and don't really mind this one being kind of a dud, then I think this is still a nice palette overall to have. But if you're like me and you're a collector and this color story doesn't necessarily uniquely speak to you, then it's probably just going to get lost in the noise of all the other eyeshadow releases. Surprisingly though, more than that palette, I actually ended up using the holiday palette from Pat McGrath. So this is the Starstruck Splendor palette. It's the one with the green color story. Yes, I have definitely had a soft spot for green this year. So that's, part of this as well. But this palette, I would say, does not have as good of a formula as the motherships. So these eyeshadows are made in the USA. The mothership eyeshadows are made in Italy. There is a slightly different formula to them, and I find that the mattes in this palette are not as buildable or blendable as the mothership ones. That said, this color story appealed to me a lot more, and so I ended up reaching for this palette much more often. To me, it's just a much more unique color story, and I really do love these two green shades. Now they are a little bit flaky and you do get fallout with this palette. So again, quality is not the #1 factor with this, but they still do look gorgeous on the lids. In terms of the blushes over here, they're honestly not the shades I would typically pair with this kind of color story, but I do find that when I open this palette, I end up just using everything together because it's much more convenient, and I have enjoyed the looks that I've come out with. In fact, I'll post here a picture of a look that I did recently with this palette that I think turned out really well. So especially since this will probably go on a heavy sale pretty soon as one of her holiday releases, I would recommend picking this up if you are interested in this color story. Alrighty, so we are finally in the home stretch. So now we have powder complexion products. Let's start with bronzer. So I have 3 bronzers here. The first one is from Pat McGrath. So even though she didn't make it into the eyeshadow category this year, her bronzer was definitely my all-time favorite for this year. I have this in the shade Nude Honey, and for me a lot of it does come down to the shade. It is a very nice neutral bronzer, which I find is actually pretty tricky to find. Most bronzers do tend to lean much more yellowy, orangey, or much more reddish, whereas this one is truly a neutral bronze. What I love about that is it means that I can use this for more of a bronzer effect, and it works really well year round. For me, in the summertime, I like to have a bit more of that bronzy, sort of sun-kissed goddess vibe. But in the winter time, like right now, I prefer just using bronzer a bit more like contour. And as you can see, this shade is very buildable and looks quite natural. It definitely captures more of that shadow effect in comparison to a lot of bronzers. Hopefully you can see that slight difference that made on my face, just making this side look a little bit more chiseled than the other side. I also do really enjoy this formula as well. As you can see, it's very easy to control. I'm able to just kind of brush into the compact without having to worry about going overboard. That's something I also sometimes struggle with bronzer. You really don't want your bronzer to be too visible on the face, but it really blends out like a dream. So I've really been enjoying this quite a lot. And I find it's also neutral enough that it works super well as nose contour, which for me is a pretty big deal since I always hate when the middle of my face just looks completely blotted out once I finish my makeup. And it's hard to find a good bronzer that works on the nose because you don't want something that looks too obvious, but it also needs to be kind of neutral enough because you want it to give you that snatched effect. I think this one is really nice for that. The other bronzer I loved this year was the Hermes bronzer in the shade Sahara. So this is definitely the bougiest bronzer in my collection. This was like over $90. And so I kind of didn't want to like this bronzer at first because it is really hard to justify the cost. But I ended up really enjoying this. So basically what's so nice about this bronzer is it's incredibly buildable. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what shade to get because I heard a lot of complaints from folks that the first two shades were a little bit too yellowy. And so I ended up going with number 3 Sahara, and I was worried about that at first because this is like kind of in the middle of their range or on the deeper side of their range, and so I wasn't quite sure if it would work for my complexion. But I actually found that this was the perfect shade. So this is not yellowy at all. Let me actually give you guys a swatch. You can see it has much more of a reddish tone. Let me swatch it next to Nude Honey so you can see the difference. Here's Nude Honey, very neutral. Here's Sahara, kind of reddish in tone. And because of the formula, even though it's one of the deeper shades, I find that it's very easy to use on my complexion. This really picks up very lightly. I know I have 3 layers of bronzer now, but I just want to show you guys a little bit. Hopefully you can see some of that shade. But yeah, it just picks up very lightly, so you don't have to worry about going overboard, at least on days when you're not using so many products on your face. It's just such a lightweight formula. It really gives you a very luxurious feeling and a lot of control over the product. Now, I will say if you do have a very deep complexion, I think this might take quite a while to build up. So I think in terms of shade inclusivity, they could definitely do a better job. But if you do have more of a light to medium skin tone and you like a product that takes some building up, that gives you that sort of control, then I think this is really hard to beat. Now, it's just a quick runner-up in the bronzer category. We have the M Cosmetics Corselet bronzer in the shade Slip. I think of this as kind of being a dupe for the Pat McGrath Nude Honey. So you can see they have pretty similar tones. They're both just very neutral bronzers. And please ignore this. This is the lipstick swatch from earlier. So I slightly prefer the Pat McGrath in terms of formulation. I think it's just a little bit easier to blend, a little bit creamier. But this is a very, very close dupe to it. And so I have found myself often reaching for this product as well. And I do think actually this came out before the Pat McGrath, so even though I'm calling it a dupe, it's not like they were imitating the Pat McGrath. Next, we have blush. And in this category, I'm surprised actually that I only have one powder blush favorite of the year, which is the Suku Melting Blush powder. I have this in shade 4 Sumiro. And this has basically become my all-time powder blush favorite. So once I kind of discovered that, I ended up spending a lot of time with this formula. It's the perfect powder kind of cream hybrid in the sense that it is overall a powder, and as you can see, applies as a powder. But what's so lovely about this formula is it has that sort of creamy effect on the skin where it looks very seamless, like you would expect from a cream. It doesn't look dry or powdery at all. It just really melts into the skin, as the name implies. And then the finish is much more kind of hydrated and creamy than what you typically see with a powder. As a result, this has just been such a go-to for me, and you can see the shade Sumiro is really pretty and peachy. It's kind of neutral enough, but also brings some warmth to the look. There is some fine shimmer in it as well, and so it adds just a faint glow to the skin. I find that if I want sort of a natural look with no highlighter, but still want a little bit of glowiness, then this product is perfect. Now, very, very sadly, Suku has discontinued this formula, so I would highly recommend, if you want to try it, go to Selfridges, go to Cult Beauty, buy it right now. I actually bought another one of these in a different shade during my recent trip to Japan, and I've been debating whether to buy like all of the remaining shades online, because basically starting I think February this year is when they discontinued this due to issues with sourcing the ingredients. And so I only found that out recently, and I'm really, really devastated because this is really the formula that has risen above all of the other blush formulas in my collection. So would highly, highly recommend this if you can get your hands on it. And the last products we have for today's video are the Hourglass palettes. So this is kind of a combination of bronzer, blush, and finishing powder. I've saved this to the end because the finishing powder is definitely the most unique aspect to these. So overall, definitely the #1 hit for me in 2023 of these two was the Hourglass Sculpture palette. This I've had for a couple years, so again, not a new palette, but definitely the most used. Probably one of my most used makeup products in general. I basically bring this with me anytime I travel because I find this is just such a perfect palette for me. This bronzer works really well. Mood Exposure, this blush, is one of my all-time favorite blushes, both in terms of tone and also in terms of formula. I love these two finishing powders. They're perfect for any look. And this highlighter is also gorgeous and wonderful for an everyday basis. So for today's look, I'm going to first go into these finishing powders. I usually just mix them together. And let me just sweep some along my face on this half so you can hopefully see some of the difference. For the longest time, I didn't really get what finishing powder was about. I really didn't understand what the point of it was, because especially when I watched YouTube videos, I felt like it didn't really look like it made any difference on camera. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see any difference on camera today either, but I would say definitely in person it makes a huge difference. So here it is on this side of my face, none on this side. And it just adds a little bit of a ethereal glow to the skin. Whenever I've put this on, people have always complimented my complexion, asked me how my skin is so healthy, because it just gives you that sort of lit from within effect. It also is wonderful for just blending out all of your complexion products. I usually put this along any of the edges just to kind of blur everything out. And it just gives your skin such a lovely sheen to it. It's not shiny, I would say, but it just gives you that sort of healthy sheen that doesn't really look makeup-y, but definitely gives you that sort of glow. Then I'm gonna go in with this highlighter and just put this a bit on my cheeks. You can see how this is a pretty subtle highlight, but that's what I love about it. This year in particular, for some reason, I've just not been very into bright highlight, even though for a while that was my jam. And so this sort of highlight has been perfect for me. Just a tiny bit of glow from within. Again, doesn't really look like you have highlighter on necessarily, at least the people who aren't really into makeup, but just gives you a little bit of dimension and a little bit of glow to finish off your look. So if you're on the market for one Hourglass compact, I would highly, highly recommend this one. I'm pretty sure it's still available on their website, even though this came out a couple years ago, but this is definitely by far my favorite curation. That said, if you want something a bit newer, they did release this year the Jellyfish palette. I put it in the owl packaging because I preferred this design. But this is the Jellyfish Color Story. This is definitely number 2 for me in terms of favorite Hourglass palettes. I do prefer the bronzer in this in comparison to the bronzer in the Sculpture palette, just because this one is a shimmery bronzer, whereas this one is matte. And I don't know, this year I've been much more into matte products, and I also find this bronzer is a little bit more neutral in comparison to the Sculpture palette one. This palette is lighter though overall than Sculpture, so these two finishing powders are a bit lighter. I do find they still work well on my skin tone because they are so sheer, so that part is fine to me. These two blushes are kind of similar for my taste. I do prefer the ones in Sculpture. I feel like you get a little bit more versatility, but these are really lovely rosy blushes as well. Hourglass does have one of my favorite blush formulas too. The one thing that really tips this palette into the number 2 place for me though is this highlighter. It is just much stronger than the one in Sculpture. So if you are someone who has a fairer skin tone and likes a bit more of a rosy highlight that's pretty high shine, I think you'll enjoy this one more. But if you want something that's a bit more subtle, then the Sculpture is definitely better. On the whole though, I've been really loving the Hourglass formulas this year. I've been bringing these palettes around with me a lot and using the finishing powders a lot more to just complete a look. I used to think of finishing powder as something I would only want to use to kind of finish off a very glam look, but what I realized this year with all the traveling is that it's actually really great when you're traveling because you can be very messy as you're applying your complexion products and then just kind of use the finishing powder to sort of blur everything and mix everything together at the end, and then you just look much more put together than if you had not done that last step. So there we have it. That is all the marathon of my best of 2023 makeup. Hopefully this was helpful for any of you who have been curious which products really stood the test of time for me. And I would love to hear in the comments what products you guys have been enjoying this year. And if there's any follow-on videos you guys would be interested in this vein, definitely let me know. I hope you guys all are having a wonderful holiday season, and I'm not sure when this is coming up, so if New Year's has happened, I hope you guys also had a really happy New Year. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!